Hello, I'm Robert Hicks, and I'd like to present to you a short tour of our temporary exhibit, Broken Bodies, Suffering Spirits, Injury, Death, and Healing in Civil War Philadelphia. If the Civil War was happening today, with the same proportion of casualties, we would be witnessing between 8 and 10 million dead due to combat wounds, injuries, and disease. Every family would be affected. And so it was in the 1860s when this war took place. But Philadelphia has its own story. We wanted to focus on a few individuals whose experience reflect the larger picture. One white soldier, one black soldier, one female nurse, one doctor, and the voice of America's poet Walt Whitman. He made hundreds of visits to the hospital to help those wounded men who were far away from home and family. He wrote poems after the war, and through the end of his life, the Civil War was predominant in his thoughts. Why did we conceive the idea to do this exhibition in the first place? It all started with this man and the letter to my left. This man, his name is Henry Hicks, and he was a very young man at the time of the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. He was wounded at Gettysburg, and in fact he received the Medal of Honor for his actions on the first day of that battle. But how did he get into this collection, and what did he say? Dr. S. Ware Mitchell, who was a doctor during the Civil War and advanced the study of the nerves, neurology, he and his son put out a questionnaire to try to get answers from veterans, now decades after the war, talking about how they would continue to live with the injuries that they had. Well, the postmaster of Philadelphia at the time was Henry Hicks, and he responds to Mitchell with a 2-page letter. It's typewritten, and the date is 1906. And he briefly mentions what happened to him at Gettysburg. He was shot in the leg, then he had an arm amputated at the elbow. And he said, after the war, I had some trouble adjusting, and he has this marvelous image of driving in a carriage. And he says, a gust of wind blew off my straw hat, and I would reach up with the right arm that I no longer have to catch my hat. And of course, he didn't catch his hat. But he says in the letter, he learned to compensate for that in time. And by the time he typewrites this letter, he's perfectly adjusted to life with one arm. But he says, every night when I sleep, I have dreams, and every time I dream, I'm a man with 2 arms and 2 hands. And in my dreams, I enjoy taking a pen and writing, and I'm writing with the right hand that I no longer have. And when I have that dream, it induces such a pain in my non-existent arm that it wakes me up in the middle of the night, and even after almost half a century. The fact that he felt a pain in the arm that's no longer there, we now call the phantom limb pain. The phantom limb syndrome comes from Dr. Mitchell and his work on Civil War soldiers. When we saw that letter, we knew we had to do this exhibit. In this exhibition, we wanted to focus on the white soldier and the black soldier. The black soldier was known as the United States Colored Troop soldier. Well, we wanted personal items from a black soldier and a white soldier, and for a USCT soldier, we got this badge. This is a badge that was purchased and worn by veterans after the Civil War. And this was owned by Presley Dawson, or Presley Dorsey, of the 43rd United States Colored Troops. It was loaned to us by the grandson of the soldier. And I repeat, grandson, not great-grandson, which also illustrates that the Civil War is not ancient history. It's still within the reach of public memory. This big drum is called a spirometer. It would have had 2 hoses. You breathe in, you breathe out, and it measures lung capacity. At the end of the war, the Army sent to all the doctors in the regiments a kit to take a variety of measurements for both white and black soldiers. Now, the Army collected all this data for a reason. What will these soldiers do when they leave the Army? Particularly the black soldiers who will no longer return to slavery. It was thought that they would go to cities and get jobs in factories. And for this purpose, a baseline for industrial insurance was needed. Well, since we didn't know anything about black soldiers, this was a major insight. And in fact, the data collected on United States colored troops constitutes the first data collected by the government to assess the health of African Americans in this country. 2 studies were created right after the Civil War. One study concluded that there was no effective difference between white and black soldiers in their performance on duty. The second study had a different conclusion. The black soldiers were inferior performers, which is pretty strange when you think about all the manual labor that black soldiers had to do in creating fortifications, digging trenches, and so on. And yet, of those two studies, the one study most influential over time was the one that found disparities. So the instrument here is a component of what we can now call racialized medicine. But the influence of this kind of a study was pretty far-reaching. Even as late as World War II, when we had the famous Tuskegee Airmen, the black soldiers who were recruited as fighter pilots, the top brass of the Army asked the question, can a black man really operate a complex machine such as an airplane? Well, when they looked for data on the performance of black soldiers, where did they get it? Well, the last time the Army had conducted any significant study was the Civil War. So the data produced on Civil War soldiers had a long-lasting impact in determining what kind of assignments black soldiers would get in the military all the way through World War II. This exhibition is not developed around any particular timeline. We want people to imagine, what would this be like if I had been there and had to participate in these events? So we've organized the exhibit very broadly around hurting, healing, dying, the major experiences of soldiers. In the case here, we have a number of specimens that have embedded bullets in them. These specimens were removed on the battlefield, either from soldiers who recovered and survived, or in some cases soldiers who had died, and the specimens were sent to the Army Medical Museum in Washington, a storehouse for specimens that were gathering during the war to help instruct military surgeons on what was happening and how to deal with it. The mini ball is the bullet you see represented here. This was a bullet fired from a rifled musket. It caused such extreme damage to the limbs. This is what required all those amputations. These specimens are arranged over an image of the human body to suggest to visitors what parts of the bodies these specimens come from. Here we have the section on healing. Now, these instruments at first glance may look pretty threatening because they're pretty heavy duty, and yes, they're involved in cutting bone, cutting flesh, amputation. But it's not only amputation. These tools are used for a variety of purposes, the smaller ones used for many minor injuries. And it's a reminder that that one projectile, the mini ball bullet, had such destructive power that in some cases amputation was the only remedy. But amputation was not an easy decision to make, and it was only when other possibilities failed that they resorted to this. A physician on the battlefield has approximately 90 seconds to consider the patient that's been brought before him, make life decisions about what to do, and if it's a decision to sacrifice a limb, that is of course going to affect that patient for the rest of his days. We did want to put to bed a common myth that in the Civil War, doctors performed bloody amputations without anesthesia. This is not true. And it is also not true that soldiers bit the bullet in order to stave off the pain. In 95% of all surgeries, anesthesia was used, either ether or chloroform. It's only in those 5% of the cases where it was simply not available and time was of the essence did the surgeries take place without them. It's true that the war did not produce new medicines for us, but it did produce a lot of knowledge about surgery and a lot of knowledge that increased our understanding of how the body works. If you see an ambulance take an injured person to emergency medical care today, we expect that person is going to arrive at the hospital and receive treatment from a battery of professionals assessing all dimensions of that person's health. That system of emergency medical care that we now take for granted was in fact the chief invention of the Civil War. Before the war, if you were injured or sick, the doctor came to you at your home. You did not go to a hospital. A hospital was known as a place where people went to die. So soldiers who were wounded coming into hospitals, maybe for the first times in their lives, are getting a different orientation. Hospitals are here to rehabilitate, repair, and send a soldier back to productive duty if possible. We've shown you some instruments that you probably expected to see, cutting instruments for amputations, for example. But we wanted to put out a few instruments that represent some areas of medicine that may be unfamiliar to you. For example, there's an item that is worn about the wrist called a sphygmograph that is wound up It's mechanical, and it creates a little strip chart recording of a pulse. So even in the Civil War, they're gathering data in the form of graphic displays of bodily functions. Also, we have what's called a magneto-electric generator. This is a hand-cranked device that generates its own alternating current. Now, this was not standard issue in the Army, but in Philadelphia there was a specialty hospital designed to look at soldiers with nerve injuries. And Dr. S. Ware Mitchell, with a team of doctors, investigated these cases of damaged nerves, and they began to use electricity, both to explore how the nerves functioned in the first place, and also how to remedy damaged nerves and reactivate them if they seem to have gone lifeless. Also in this case, we have a prosthetic limb, and as you might expect with all those amputations, there was a big demand, and manufacturers vied with each other to present the government with models that were functional and comfortable to wear. And in some cases, we know that amputations themselves were conducted in particular ways with the idea of wearing a prosthetic limb comfortably afterwards. Also in this case, we have things that everybody would recognize: a hypodermic syringe and a thermometer. And this particular thermometer is bent, and that is intentional because it's not placed in the mouth, but in the armpit. We also have, in this case, a very early hypodermic syringe, but it's not used exactly the same way as getting a shot is today at the doctor's office. A small lancet would be first used to cut the skin, then the needle would be introduced into that cut, and the doctor would slowly inject the solution of morphine directly into the body. And then it would be removed, and that cut would be bandaged. In addition to all those battlefield injuries, disease is also a problem. These long glass tubes contain specimens that represent the appearance of dysentery, lesions in the digestive tract. So specimens such as these were also collected and saved during the Civil War to study the phenomena, also to preserve specimens against a future date when cures and new medicines might come into play. But also in those days, it was possible to vaccinate against one disease, smallpox. There were multiple outbreaks in the southern states, and the Confederacy had a difficult time finding vaccine. But you see on display a small device that looks like a little chrome-plated stapler. It's actually a device for early vaccination. It's meant to be used to prick a pustule on a person suffering from a mild form of smallpox, remove a little bit of the fluid in the sore, and then go to a healthy person and jab them with it, with the idea that they get a very mild form of the disease, but after they recover, they're immune from smallpox. I'm standing in front of the amputation booth. This is the one interactive of this Civil War exhibit. A person will enter some data about themselves on this keypad here: their height, their sex, their skin tone. They enter this booth and they stand on a pair of green footprints that align themselves with a full-length mirror. But in place of their right arm, they see a computer-generated arm. And the idea is, over the course of about 2.5 minutes, they watch what happens when a mini ball strikes the arm. The arm is wounded and it becomes infected as the gangrene sets in and becomes worse. So the arm is amputated. There's healing and then a prosthetic limb applied. And later, the phantom limb syndrome makes itself apparent. Well, this concludes our small tour of broken bodies, suffering spirits. We know that you are not able to see this exhibit, but if you're interested in more, we also have posted to the web 9 videos, a medical historical travelogue of Civil War Philadelphia. If you are a student or a teacher, or you're an undergraduate, you might be interested in our set of 10 online lesson plans. These lesson plans span a variety of activities connected with Civil War medicine, from how to amputate to the health of the United States Colored Troops soldier. These are designed to focus on becoming acquainted with primary sources in the history of medicine, so it puts you in the front lines of the Civil War. Thank you again for visiting.